Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and I'm joined today by Dr. Mark Sheskin. He is Assistant Professor of Social Sciences at Minerva Schools at KGI and Research Affiliate at Yale University, where he is coordinating the childlab.com. His research interests are at the intersection of philosophy and psychology, with a particular focus on the origins of pro-social behavior and moral judgment. So, Dr. Sheskin, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you for inviting me to do this.
Okay, great. So I guess this is going to be a very exciting conversation because we're basically trying to integrate here some topics from philosophy, some major ones, particularly from moral philosophy, with empirical research on these same topics on the basis of developmental psychology and trying to understand, I guess, how children develop their morality and their moral entities and things like that. So the first thing I would like to ask you is, I guess that one of the main things that people explore in the developmental psychology of morality is trying to understand how children develop their pro-sociality and things like if they care about equality or not. So, what are the types of things that children care about when it comes to, for example, equality and fairness? And how long do they take to develop those sorts of mental capacities, let's say?
So I think one of the first things to look into is the difference between when you can find some evidence of some cognitive capacity, more than zero, versus when it becomes a common part of what children are doing, or when it becomes important as a motivation compared to other motivations. So a lot of really exciting work over recent years has looked at how you can find hints of really advanced moral judgment or social judgment, even in infancy. So infants who expect characters to be treated fairly, each should receive the same, except maybe if one does more work than the other, then the one who did more work should get more than the other one. So really advanced understanding very, very young. But just finding some evidence of advanced cognition very young is different than the full developmental trajectory of how do we get more and more elements integrating together, becoming common, things like that. And so one of the things that I've been focusing on in my own research is maybe tapping the brakes a little bit, slowing down on all of the excitement about young children showing full adult moral behavior, would be the straw man that I would be attacking immediately. And some things definitely seem to come online more slowly. And then what's contributing to them is probably going to be a combination between input they're getting from their environment, both unstated social norms, experiences they're having, maybe explicit things they're being taught, and then also some natural maturation. And I'm especially interested in the natural maturation part because it's the part that maybe gets less attention. So just to immediately throw one concrete result out there, if you give one child less than another, the child who receives less is very likely to complain about this and may even use the terminology of fairness. It's unfair that that person got two, I'm only getting one. But there are several things that might be going on to motivate this complaint. Even though the terminology of objective fairness is being used, it might be motivated by things other than or in addition to some very abstract, dispassionate application of fairness. So for example, maybe the child doesn't have any understanding of it. It's just invoking some word. I know if I say that's not fair, I maybe get more. And maybe they don't even know what they're saying. Or maybe they have some sense of it, but they only really care about fairness when they are on the losing side. And it could go past that. It could be that they would rather be on the winning side. They don't want fairness. They want unfairness that benefits them. And so in some of my early work with Paul Bloom and Karen Wynn, we gave children choices between different outcomes. So replicating the standard complaint, if they get less than someone else, if I give you, let's say you're a 5-year-old, I give you a choice between you get 2 and another 5-year-old gets 2, or you get 2 and he gets 3, then 5-year-olds are very, very likely to choose 2 each. I don't want to be at this disadvantage. Well, what about you get 2 and the other 5-year-old gets 2, or you get 2 and he gets 1? Well, here, if you're motivated by fairness, if you're motivated by generosity, either of those things, you would choose 2 each. But in fact, what we find is a lot of 5-year-olds choosing 2 and 1. They don't want fairness, they want unfairness where they're on the winning side of it. And it's even more extreme than that. Given the choice between you get 2, the other 5-year-old gets 2, or you get 1 and he gets 0, a lot of 5-year-olds will choose 1 and 0. So I want to be at an unfair advantage, even if that means everyone, including me, is getting less than we could. And so this is one example, there are others, of early behavior by young children that shows some room to grow. And then, in fact, we see that with older children, they're much more likely to say 2 each. Even if I could get 2 and the other child gets 1, no, everyone should be getting an equal amount. So depending upon exactly what behaviors you're looking at or exactly what cognitions you're looking at, and also across different situations, you'll see a lot of variability in what behaviors we see at what ages. And this, of course, is true of adults as well. What we pay attention to as adults in terms of fair behavior, how motivated we are by fairness compared to other motivations we have, is also going to vary a huge amount across people, across situations.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting the emphasis that you put on unfairness, let's say, and how children, I don't know exactly until what ages we're talking about here, but they prefer to be themselves favored in some way when compared to others. Because isn't it the case that from 3 years of age onward or something like that, that it's when children start to pay attention to norms and start having more of a normative behavior? I'm asking you that because wouldn't that indicate that they would also care about the social image that they transmit if they, for example, are sharing things and they want to end up with the biggest part of it all, or something like that?
I think the critical words in what you just said is 3 years old is when they start to care about.
Okay.
So over time, you're going to see development in different ways. And in many different studies, you can see effects of all of the different things that you might expect would have effects. So if a child is making these decisions and they are being observed by the recipient, that changes things. If they're being observed by many other people, that can change things. If they're being observed by someone who's a member of their group versus someone who's not a member of their group, all sorts of things can influence their behavior. And so often what you want to do in any particular line of research is be very clear about what are the things we're interested in looking at the effect of. And so in my studies, I have not manipulated any audience effects where they might want to be showing off their adherence to these social norms. In fact, I often have tried to be as bored and disinterested as possible. I kind of imagine a blackjack dealer in Las Vegas who maybe doesn't like their job very much, who's just, staring off into the distance a little bit and dealing out these options. And in the case of the studies I've often run, they're color-coded. So I might be laying out some distributions and saying, if you choose blue, you get 2, and the other child gets 2. If you choose green, you get 2, the other child gets 1. So, blue or green. And even the decision the child is saying is just a color-coded option to someone who doesn't appear to care what they choose. And so a lot of what I've done is try to decrease these audience effects. And it's totally an interesting thing, how much would increasing the audience effects increase their pro-social behavior, their compliance with norms? And I think the answer is quite a bit, especially at older ages.
Mm-hmm. But Isn't there any stage of development or any age where children, even if they are not being directly observed, show any sort of behavior where they seem to really objectively, from an objective point of view, care about what other people get, for example?
Certainly when it is a third-party situation. If you ask a child, these toys can be given out in the following ways, and you provide them with a fair option and an unfair option for two other recipients, they have very consistent preferences for each person should receive the same amount, unless there's some compelling reason otherwise, such as one has worked very hard. When it comes to their own motivation to behave that way when their welfare is at stake, or when they could be winning against someone else, then I think we're in the world of competing motivations, where you're going to have different things pulling on their behavior, and a lot of it will depend upon exactly which child you're asking in which situation, and it's going to also depend on the day. You know, there's going to be variation in even stuff like that.
So one of the things that you referred there, I guess, is that children also care about merit, right? So, for example, if they are playing a game and there's one child there that works much more or puts much more effort into it than the others, then if she gets a little bit more than them, they think that that's fair.
Yes, absolutely. And there's several researchers who have done research like this. It's really cool. I immediately think of the group led by Mike Tomasello. And especially when children are in a collaborative context with each other, where it's clear that they're working together to achieve a goal, a lot of this psychology comes online and becomes a significant part of what's driving their behavior earlier than it would otherwise.
I mean, would it be fair to say that maybe over time and over their developmental period, let's say, children progressively care more and more about what other people think about their behavior and if they're being fair or unfair and things like that, because since children or human infants go through such a long period of development where they are dependent of others. I mean, they depend on their kin, but they also partially depend on non-kin people, right?
Absolutely. I think a statement like that is supported from many different directions. Not just we have evidence of children behaving in this way, but also when we start looking at evolutionary analyses of why humans care about fairness at all, it suggests that it should likely become a stronger motivation as time goes on. I'm thinking here of work done by many people, but also a paper that I wrote in collaboration with a postdoc advisor I had, Nicolas Baumard, and Coralie Chevalier, in which we make an argument that although some amount might be learned from the environment, there's also a natural maturation of caring about fairness, caring about your social reputation that is growing in the same way that you get adult teeth growing in after baby teeth. It just naturally happens. And the reason is this: as a very young human, as an infant, as a toddler, you are receiving all of your resources for free from adult caregivers. You don't need to be earning your keep in any way. As you get older and older and older, your ability to gain resources is getting increasingly tied into getting a share of group efforts that you have contributed to. So who are you going to take on a hunt with you? Are you going to take the person who puts in their fair share of the work and then takes only their fair share of the reward at the end? Or are you going to take the person who, after the hunt is done, kills you and steals all of your stuff and the animal that you killed? Well, clearly you want to go with the person who's trustworthy and moral and nice and fair. And so as children age up, they, number one, are losing a lot of the resources that they're getting for free from adult caregivers. Suddenly there's a younger sibling who is the primary focus of the free resources, and their ability to contribute to group efforts increases. Even if you know that a 4-year-old is a wonderfully moral individual with the best reputation, you're not going to take them hunting with you because they're not going to be useful. But as you get older and older, your ability to contribute to these group efforts is increasing. And so I think this evolutionary analysis provides a reason why we see older and older children going into adolescence and then adulthood caring an increasing amount about their moral reputation.
Mm-hmm. Talking about equality, I guess that in the literature on the developmental psychology of paying attention to equality, let's say, there are two different types of equality children pay attention to: numerical and quality equality, right? Could you tell us what's the difference there, and I mean how children deal with both of those two types?
Sure. So remember the results we were talking about a little while ago, where by the time children are 7 or 8 years old, they will say, I should get 2 and the other child should get 2. It should be equal in that way, not, I get more than them. Well, in another study, we asked children to divide 4 toys between themselves and another child. The additional thing we did in this study was that the 4 toys were different from each other. So there was a bouncy ball, there was a little container of Play-Doh, there was a number 2 pencil, and there was a sticker that I made myself to be very boring. I printed out like on my home printer, just like a little black arrow. I stuck it to some wax paper. And we did not name these toys for the children. We did not point out that they varied in quality, but they did vary in quality. 2 of them were very nice, the bouncy ball and the Play-Doh, and 2 of them were not as exciting, the pencil and the very bad sticker that I made myself to be not exciting. So what we found was with very young children, 4 years old, 5 years old, they would usually take all 4 toys for themselves. Not surprising, this is replicating the previous results that we saw where young children are wanting to be getting a lot, and maybe they even want other people to be getting less. But what about the 8-year-olds? In the previous study, we saw that 8-year-olds would be very likely to say, I get 2, the other person gets 2, with identical resources. Well, now with these different resources, we could see, do they provide 1 good and 1 bad toy per person? Or do they provide 2 toys per person, but they take the 2 better ones for themselves? And that's exactly what we found. The 8-year-olds were almost unanimous in providing exactly 2 toys per person. So very clear numerical fairness. They would not violate that. They would not take 3, they would not take 4, they would be taking 2. But they almost always would take the 2 better ones for themselves, which is a very specific middle point between selfishness and fairness, where you're following some very specific rule. Maybe you have some plausible deniability. You can point to the outcome and you can say, look, each person got an equal number. And it's kind of difficult to debate the merits of these. Is the bouncy ball and the Play-Doh really that much better than the pencil and the arrow sticker? In fact, we elicited some preference ratings from the children, and although most of them had the preferences we expected, not all of them did. And so through some combination of maybe they're following rules without really caring about fairness, or maybe they care about fairness but, just somewhat, or maybe they want plausible deniability. Through some combination of all of that, we found this very consistent behavior of 8-year-olds following numerical fairness, but not actual quality fairness.
Mm-hmm. Right. So we are talking here about development, but there's also another side of things that, through which we can approach the study of morality, that is the more phylogenetic approaches by studying other, for example, primates, right, and particularly the ones that are the closest to us, like, for example, chimpanzees, bonobos, gorillas. What would you say are maybe the limitations with trying to understand aspects of human morality by studying other primates?
The way I tend to think about comparative psychology in general, where you're comparing human cognition to the cognition of other animals, is through the lens of Tinbergen's four whys. And so for people who are watching or listening to this who are not familiar, let's say that I'm just trying to understand the human eye or human vision. So one thing I might do to understand human vision is to look at all of the actual proximate mechanisms, the things I could poke with a stick. So, okay, here's the retina, here's the optic nerve, here's the visual cortex of the brain. In any general human, typical human, here are the different parts that we see. You could look at the development of this. So if you go back enough years ago, 35 years ago, there was no Mark Sheskin visual system. And now there is. So how did we go from not having one through fetal development, through developmental childhood, all the way to now? There's also looking at phylogeny. So how did we get the vertebrate eye in general across evolutionary time, across many different species? And then the adaptive function of it. So visual systems are good for finding mates, finding food, avoiding predators, avoiding walking off of cliffs. And ideally, all four of these answers are not in competition with each other. Each one helps you understand the other ones. And you as a particular researcher might have a question that is very well suited to a particular one of these four, and the others don't really relate to it. Or you might have a question that relates very well to 2 or 3 or 4. And ideally, for any complicated phenomenon like vision, or, as I'll start talking about in a moment, like human morality, fairness in particular maybe, the picture that you see is built up from all four of these being consistent with one another. And so one of the things that is very relevant for some of the claims I was making earlier is, do we see fairness behavior in non-human primates of the sort that we see in humans? And one of the arguments that I was making was that adult human fairness is about people choosing who they want to cooperate with, who do we want to go out hunting with, who do we want to do mutual childcare with, all sorts of different things. And if that's really what human fairness is about, then we should expect that we don't actually see much fairness in non-human species. Because although there's some group activity amongst maybe chimpanzees, maybe doing some communal hunting, there's not the same flexibility of let's across a wide variety of tasks, even new ones that we come up with as a culture. Let's have, a huge amount of flexibility where, okay, you and I own a bakery and you work 5 days a week and I work 2 days a week. And so maybe we shouldn't split the proceeds equally. Maybe you should get 5/7 and I should get 2/7. We don't see this sort of situation in non-human species. And so maybe we shouldn't see the same degree of fairness. And so a lot of the research on potential fairness behavior in non-human species relates to these claims that I've been making about the adaptive function of it for humans, maybe what that means about the developmental trajectory that I spoke of. And this, by the way, is an active debate in comparative psychology. How much do we see fairness in non-human species? If we see a lot, then some of the other pieces of the story need to be revised. If we see not a lot or none, then that's consistent with the story I've previously been telling.
Mm-hmm. But even if we don't see a lot of commonalities in terms of the development of morality in humans and other primates, that doesn't automatically mean that there are more aspects of human morality that derive from, for example, culture or other aspects of the environment. It could also be biologically based, in the sense that perhaps since we departed from our last common ancestor, we also had time to go through a somewhat long period of evolution and being exposed to different selective pressures than the other primates. And so, even those differences could also be the result of evolutionary processes.
Absolutely. So the way that particular bits of evidence in comparative psychology are going to weigh on different conclusions about human morality is always going to be a much more complicated discussion than just, oh, we found in a particular study that 30 capuchin monkeys behaved in the following way, therefore we can strongly conclude the following about human psychology. And this relates to a much broader issue, I think, in how we make scientific conclusions, where, let's say we're trying to understand, I think that the Earth is roughly spherical, not flat. Probably most or all of the viewers and listeners of this agree with me. You know, the world is roughly spherical, not flat. Okay, but why do we think that? Is it because there was one particularly compelling scientific paper in which a bunch of scientists used very precise lasers and measured a bunch of things and then did complicated analyses and then showed, yes, the Earth is roughly spherical rather than flat? No, that's not why we think that. The reason why we think that is, well, number one, we know that that's what respectable people think, right? So some of it might not be really rational deliberation. It's just, oh, I know this is what the people who I want to be like think. But let's put that aside. When we are rationally deliberating, the reason why we say the Earth is roughly spherical is because that is the only possibility that we are aware of that makes sense of the huge amount of information we have at hand. If that was false, we would have so many questions. We would immediately say, what's going on with airline pilots who tell us that they can fly this direction or they can fly this direction, east or west? And they can get to, the same destination with enough fuel. Sometimes to get to some place on the other side of the globe, you fly over the North Pole. What's going on with that? And it's not just airline pilots. Suddenly we need to ask questions about, wait, how does GPS work? So there's just thousands of questions where we say this picture of the world that we had built up, this picture of reality that we had built up, makes a lot of sense when we have a spherical Earth. A lot of stuff breaks when we don't. And that's the sort of conclusions that we can really feel settled in. And we're not there yet with most parts of human moral psychology. When we're saying, what exactly is human fairness like? What are the elements we, take account of? Why do we take account of those? What influences it? We are going to be less confident about all of those things than we are about the Earth being spherical. But as we build up more and more into the picture, and as I mentioned before, I tend to think of the picture often in terms of these Tinbergen categories, in which you want the full picture of what the mechanism is and how it grows in an individual and how it's related to things in evolution. We want all of these pieces to agree with each other.
And since I referred to culture, let me just ask you right away about a paper that was published I guess last year. I'm not sure if you were the main author or not, but the title of it is "The Needs of the Many do not outweigh the needs of the few. The limits of individual sacrifice across diverse cultures." So could you tell us about this paper? Because I guess that what the sort of questions that you were trying to explore and to understand is if people make any trade-offs, and if so, what those trade-offs are when they're thinking about, for example, putting more weight on individual well-being or the well-being of the group, right?
Yes, so with that paper, I am in the first author position on that, and I did take the lead on writing up the draft that was published. But I want to start by recognizing the huge list of authors included there, where it was a bunch of data collection over a long period of time and a lot of locations. And for much of that time, the person organizing it was my postdoc advisor, who I worked with a while ago, Nicolo Beaumard. So it's very much a group effort. And in that paper, we were looking at how people in a lot of locations around the world answered some moral dilemmas. that had roughly the structure of a trolley problem, for anyone who's familiar with those. They were not trolley problems, but they had roughly similar features. And we found a lot of variety in the way that people answered our questions, but that was not necessarily surprising. These were being asked in different languages, in different contexts. I went to a park in Manhattan, and I asked random people in a park in Manhattan. Other people were, stopping people on the streets of some city, maybe, as they left religious services. We were not attempting to have a very controlled, everyone has exactly the same experience. From my perspective, having a huge variety was in fact useful, because the question was, when you have a bunch of data from people around the world in a lot of different circumstances, okay, there are some differences, but what do you still find as being very consistent? And we found that, well, number one, when individuals are in equivalent situations, yeah, of course you should roughly maximize overall welfare. So if you have a choice, I'll translate this into trolley terms because our exact scenarios, I don't think it's important to describe it in terms of them. If a trolley is definitely going to hit one of two groups, and you can choose if it's the group of 1 or the group of 5. Pretend there's not even a default. Then sure, have it spare the most number of people. Likewise, we found harm to individuals should be taken into account, and some types of individual harm can trump overall group welfare. So here, I guess actually I will describe one of our scenarios for this. It was someone can save a bunch of lives by running into a house that is on fire. So what if they can save 5 lives, but they're going to die? Are they morally required to do this? Are they blameworthy if they don't? And people tended to agree, no, they're not blameworthy for not sacrificing their own life in order to save a bunch of others. And this type of paper, saying what's consistent across cultures, what's consistent even when we have a lot of variability in who we're asking and how we're asking it, what language we're asking it in, etc., is part of a general interest I have in morality, of saying what at the heart of morality is really, really consistent, and then maybe gets expressed in different ways depending upon the exact situation and how people are interpreting the context. Because I think that although you can research the differences, and although doing so is often very important, often there's way more similarity than people expect in a lot of moral evaluations. This goes back to a classic example that there's a decent chance someone else has mentioned on your program, of the Colossians and the Greeks each being asked what they do with their dead. And the ancient Greeks say, oh, we burn our dead. And they're asked, oh, but what about eating them? And they say, oh, this is monstrous. We would never do that. But the Colossians say the reverse. Oh, we eat our dead. We want to honor them. Oh, we'd never burn them. This is monstrous. And you could take the conclusion, oh, look at how completely different. Or you could focus on, oh, look at how completely the same. Because although there's some cultural difference in how you show respect for your dead, the important core thing is showing respect for the dead. And so, yes, if we go worldwide and we ask people different scenarios, there's some really cool research doing the dictator game in a lot of different cultures. So you ask a bunch of people, oh, here's a pot of resources. How much do you get? How much does another person get? And you'll see some variation. And that variation correlates with some things. But probably what's going on, and I mean this as an interesting account, not a deflationary account, probably what's going on is that the participants in these studies are interpreting the questions in different ways, or they are having a different default about a stranger that you meet in a one-time interaction. How likely is it to be a cooperative interaction versus a competitive interaction? And it's the same moral psychology being tuned to local environmental factors and expectations. But it's not that we find deep cross-cultural moral differences as much as we might expect, although there are some.
But even putting aside for a bit the diversity or the variability that we might find in terms of moral systems or moral values that are the most prevalent in different societies, I mean, isn't it the case that we've evolved a conflictive moral intuitions, and particularly when we're thinking about dealing with different sorts of people, like, for example, our own kin or our friends and people from our communities, or even people from outside our own groups or the out groups. I mean, is there any way for us to have a sort of moral, realistic perspective starting from an evolutionary psychological account of human morality?
I think that a lot of the differences we see are tweaking some evolutionary set points. And they're doing it in ways that evolution has been set up to be tweaked, where we can have cognitive mechanisms that are flexible to the environment. And these have been useful for our evolutionary ancestors. So when we look at how different people are weighing the welfare of themselves versus their friends and family, other group members, strangers, enemies, there are two lines of research that come to mind. One is on welfare trade-off ratios. Some names here are Aaron Sell, working on some of the important papers with Tooby and Kosmides at University of California, Santa Barbara, originally. And then also Dave Rand on social heuristics. So quickly taking each of these in turn. Welfare trade-off ratios is this line of research trying to formalize mathematically some of the ways in which I value you compared to me. So let's say that I could choose for you to get $1 or me to get $1. Okay, I choose for me to get $1. What if I could choose for you to get $2 or I get $1? Ooh, well, now I feel conflicted because I can cause you a greater benefit, but I am taking a cost on it. So I don't know, reluctantly I choose $1 for myself. I feel a little bit bad, unlike when it was 1 and 1, but that's what I do. And so the question is, where do I switch? Where do I say, I think that I would rather choose for you to get $4.80 rather than me getting $1? And then we can ask the same for multiple different targets. Well, where is my welfare trade-off ratio so that I'm switching from saying, yes, give me the dollar to give the greater amount of money to the other person for my brother, for my friend, for my acquaintance, for a friend of a friend who I don't know myself, for some outgroup member. And I think a lot of what we see in some of the cross-cultural research I referred to before is, where's your expectation about the default welfare trade-off ratio you should have towards different groups and strangers? So if we exist in a society with a lot of market integration, is the jargon for this, a society where we're constantly exchanging goods and services with each other. I don't grow any of my own food. I'm going and I'm purchasing, dinner from a restaurant. I'm going to the grocery store. I'm constantly exchanging money for things. My expectation is I see someone on the street, we're probably going to have a nice cooperative interaction. I very rarely have conflict with people. If, on the other hand, we live in a society where you have a close group of people that you're constantly collaborating with, but a stranger you're unlikely to have a cooperative interaction with, well, this is probably going to influence your welfare trade-off ratio some, where you're just expecting, well, why would I be benefiting this stranger? They're not a potential friend. Strangers are friends you just haven't met yet, is not something that is equally true on all parts of the planet at all times. So I think that influences a lot. The second thing is social heuristics. Dave Rand, who started off at MIT, then he was at Yale for a while, and now he's back at MIT, or actually he went Harvard, Yale, MIT. So over time, we build up expectations of what in different contexts is the most likely situation I'm going to be in. Is this likely to be a cooperative context or a competitive context? And then we're not always calculating what's my best move here? Should I be selfish, or shall we say immediately selfish, just trying to maximize my resource welfare, or should I be acting in a way that helps me have a good moral reputation? We're not constantly doing that evaluation. We just have social heuristics built up. And this is another thing that I think it can be, that we have cognitive capacities built into our brain by evolution that are looking for information in the environment to help set these expectations of how much should I be expecting things to be cooperative versus competitive, what are the cues in my environment to each type of situation, what, when I'm in a cooperative situation, should my welfare trade-off ratios be like, when I'm in a competitive situation, how competitive is it? Is this live or die, or is this just we're not going to be friends?
Mm-hmm. From a philosophical perspective and thinking about our evolved morality, do you think that there's any set of moral values that all people could agree on and that we could call an objective morality?
Well, I think there's two things going on there. One is, could we have a set of minimal moral principles that everyone agrees on? And the second thing is, if we got that agreement, would that represent some sort of objective moral truth? Yeah. And we could have an answer yes to the first thing, oh, this everyone agrees with, without it representing objective moral truth, right? Maybe there was a time where you could ask everyone on Earth, hey, is this thing you're standing on spherical or flat? And everyone would say flat, but that doesn't mean that they were right. So, okay, is there something that, some minimal list of moral principles or concepts or facts that we could all agree on? And even though I try to have a toe or maybe even an entire foot in the world of moral philosophy, I'm mostly in the world of psychology. And so I like to make only modest claims about this sort of stuff. And so there just certainly are people who claim, yes, there is such a list. So for example, some listeners, viewers might immediately think of domains, such as those popularized by Jonathan Haidt. Oh, there's harm, and everyone cares about harm to some extent. Oh, there's fairness, everyone cares about that to some extent. In-group versus out-group, hierarchy within the group, purity. I think the sixth semi-recent one is freedom and liberty versus oppression. And even though the details might vary, the amount that we care about these might vary, like those represent some amount of consensus. But there are ways to be suspicious of this. So let's focus on the harm domain. So yes, everyone cares about harm, but when you look at the details, what counts as an exception to the rule on when you can harm people? So certainly there's all sorts of harm that we think is morally required. Most people, not all, but most, have some sort of retributive view of justice, where if you've wronged someone else, then you yourself should be wronged in some way. Imagine, for example, that I tell you a story of there's Adam and Bob, and Bob locks Adam in a small room, and there's not much to do in the room, and Adam is very bored, and he gets very plain food, just the minimum needed to survive. This is a very different story if I tell you that Bob is a jailer doing his job in society, and Adam is some serial killer who must be quarantined for his own benefit, for the benefit of society, compared to if this is a kidnapping situation. So there are people, I think Jesse Prinz is a moral philosopher who falls into this camp of saying, really, once you start looking at the exceptions to the rules and what counts as that, we really don't see many things we can put our finger on as universal moral principles. I don't think I would go that far. I think that there are things we can typically agree fall within this category of moral principles. But I also have some hesitation about this entire question for a reason that you didn't quite ask, but I think is related, which is, does it make sense to talk about a human moral faculty at all as this sort of thing that exists as something that we can point to? Or is it some shorthand for a bunch of different stuff going on? So here I'm thinking of two things. I'm thinking of, in philosophy, a distinction between artificial kinds and natural kinds. And then an argument that I think is inspired by this, by Joshua Green, on, well, what exactly is morality? Mm-hmm. So just to quickly bring up natural and artificial kinds, a natural kind probably is something like hydrogen atoms, right? Hydrogen atoms exist in the world, but more than that, categorizing all of the hydrogen atoms as a category, that really exists independent of our human purposes. Mm-hmm. If space aliens were to visit and we were able to communicate with them and we were to tell them this category of hydrogen atoms and they were to say, I have no idea what you're talking about, this is meaningless to us, what? I think that would be very surprising because it's really this natural kind. On the other hand, pets that are good for a small apartment picks out things that really exist. And let's put aside the issue of domestication. It picks out things that exist in the natural world. Yeah. So it's not that these aren't real, but the category itself is artificial. It's just about human purposes. And so where this connects to morality is I think the entire idea of having something that we're talking of as human moral psychology is an artificial kind. It's something that we're roughly putting together as something that we want to talk about. But what it contains is a huge variety of different cognitive processes that each have their own story of what they are and what they're doing and how they develop over childhood and what evolutionarily put them there in our head. And it's not just one thing. And depending upon what your goal is, you'll end up picking out a slightly different subset of things. So some people, when they're talking about morality for some goal, might be picking out this subset. And other people, when they're talking about some slightly different thing with some slightly different goal, might be pulling out some different subset that's only partially overlapping. And so this makes any question about morality way more difficult to talk about because, well, what even are we talking about when we say morality? What are we trying to pull out? So I don't know where that leaves us, but mostly me just being in a state of confusion and not wanting to make any grand claims about there being something that's definitely universal, while also agreeing that there's plenty of species-typical cognitive mechanisms in our brain. I think we've got cognitive mechanisms for computing welfare trade-off ratios. I think we've got cognitive mechanisms for noticing obvious physical harms in our environment, finding them salient, and making social judgments based on them. I think we have cognitive mechanisms for noting when people are putting in a lot of effort into a collaboration. We have cognitive mechanisms for tracking how much people are getting out of a collaboration, etc.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's just explore one last topic in our conversation, and going all the way back to the beginning of our talk, we were referring to things like equality and how children in this case think about and deal with equality. And there's a big issue that is going around nowadays and people talk a lot about from a political perspective, that is, I'm not sure if we should say that people are really worried about economic inequality, but at least people pay a lot of attention to that issue. Do we know if what people really care about when it comes to this topic is the economic inequality itself, or if it's rather economic unfairness in terms of their thinking that it's not really an issue that resources are unequally distributed, but perhaps they are unfairly distributed in society?
A really important topic. And here I'm relying a lot in what I'll say on a paper written with Christina Starmans and Paul Bloom, in which we discuss these issues. And I think when people are looking at the level of inequality in a society like the United States, there are a lot of things that they could be paying attention to. So one thing that people could be paying attention to is that the huge gap between the richest and the poorest, when you look at the poorest, they are in extreme poverty, and it would be morally good to relieve that poverty. And so even if this is expressed in terms of economic inequality, one thing to be motivated by is not the fact that the rich have a lot, it's just that the poor have so little, and it would be nice if they had more. Another thing that you could be worried about is to what extent are the amounts that each person have reflecting fairness. So I think of myself compared to an emergency room doctor. An emergency room doctor, I'm imagining spending huge numbers of hours working in a highly stressful situation that they don't enjoy that much and having huge benefits for society. I work quite a bit, but not that many hours compared to the emergency room doctor I'm thinking of. I have fun in my job. I'd be doing it even if I got paid less. I mean, don't tell anyone paying me that. But, I'm enjoying it. How much good do I do for society? I don't know, but less than the emergency room doctor, right? So I think that the emergency room doctor should earn more than me. Let's get quickly one more domain in mind, because I don't want to just be talking emergency room doctors. J.K. Rowling wrote a really popular Harry Potter book series. Let's say that I publish a novel. Should I receive as much money for my novel as J.K. Rowling received for hers? No, I think not. And I think, number one, these people deserve more than me. But number two, society functions better if they get more than me, because it motivates people to be doing these sorts of things. So when we look at, are the very poorest people, or even the group up from that, people who have some amount of resources, or middle income people, or high level income people, or the very, very rich, when we look at how much each of these have, how much does it reflect what they deserve based on various metrics? And so another thing you could say is it looks like some of the poor people who are working really hard hours in jobs that they don't enjoy, maybe according to different ways of thinking about this, it would be morally better if they were paid more. Likewise, the very richest people, could it be that the very richest person does deserve massively more money than me? But maybe what they deserve is 1,000 times as much money as I have, rather than 1,000,000 times as much money as I have, or whatever the numbers at stake here are. They're so large I can't even really contemplate them, so I don't know if I'm choosing the right multipliers here. So one of the things you could be worrying about is the fairness of what's going on, and does it match it? And there's many more things, but I'll just provide one more. A third thing you could be worrying about really is just the inequality. This person has X amount, this person has Y amount. X and Y are not equal, and they should be. So importantly, when you ask people about this last one, almost no one is bothered by that. People think that in society, various people should have different amounts. It's not that everyone should have the same. And I've already discussed some of the reasons for this. Most people think, that the emergency room doctor should be earning more money than Mark Sheskin. J.K. Rowling should have more money than Mark Sheskin. Should she have quite as many castles as she has? I'm assuming she has multiple castles. No, but maybe she should have one or two. So people generally don't think that we should have exact equality, which has some implications for how we talk about the other issues. We maybe should be more precise in our language than just talking about, oh, inequality is terrible. Instead, we should be saying that the level of poverty in the world is unacceptable. Or the very richest have way more resources than they should. They should have more resources than many other people, at least some of them, but they shouldn't have as much. Or we could really get into the details and say, okay, as a society, how much should we have as the amount that our teachers are being paid? How much should we have as the amount that our emergency room doctors are being paid, our professors are being paid, etc.? And one response to this is, oh, well, let the free market decide. And this quickly gets us into a bunch of political discussions. But the line that I'm pushing here is one that says, well, here's something that I'd be comfortable saying, which is maybe there was a previous time in the world economy in which the free market could do a good job of this. But most people accept some amount of regulation of the free market. And as time has gone on, and the ability to have huge resource differentials has increased and increased and increased, including positive feedback loops, where you can really have huge accumulations of wealth, it could be that the amount of regulation we need has increased. I'm not committing here to particular regulations or particular levels of regulation, but if you accept some amount of interference in the free market, I think it's probably reasonable to agree that the amount of regulation we need now is more than we needed in the year 1800.
Mm-hmm. So you're still taking seriously when people go, for example, mad about when they look back in time and they see that, for example, 40 years ago or something, the difference in salary between a CEO and a regular employee, I mean, it was much smaller than it is today, particularly in countries like, for example, the United States. I mean, that's about inequality. It's not directly about fairness, but you still take that reaction seriously, right?
Well, I think that both reactions are possible. You could say, this person is earning 400 times what this other person is earning. And without knowing anything else, you say there's no way that that could be acceptable. Mm-hmm. Or you could look at the specifics of what each one is contributing, what the world would be like if each of them stopped contributing what they're contributing. And then you might say, based on a very careful analysis, the details of which are almost certainly going to be controversial, the CEO should be earning 126 times what the worker in the business is earning, and 400 times is massively more than 126 times. And so the problem here is one of unfairness, not just raw inequality. And I think both reactions are possible. In many circumstances, the one that's going to get more support is the one that is framed in terms of actual fairness rather than just equality. And certainly saying everyone should have exact equality is the one that strategically, like even for someone who thinks that's true, it's probably strategically not the best way to get people on board with you, because most people think that people should be earning different amounts. The ER doctor should be earning more than me.
Mm-hmm. And not only that, but also because we've already run those kinds of social experiments, I guess, and they didn't go they didn't go that right.
Exactly, right. You could either, based on sort of first principles, say this is not how we should set up society, or you could look at the best evidence available and say, when we've tried to set up society like this, it led to disastrous outcomes, which is merely the best evidence available. But it's the best evidence available. So tentatively, I would say, yes, society doesn't work well when you try to implement exact equality. Specifically, when that leads to unfair equality, because we prefer inequality when that inequality is fair. Just though, to make sure this is stated, the level of inequality we have in a country like the United States is almost certainly an unfair amount of inequality. Mm-hmm. And so probably we should be trying to reduce the level of inequality to where it is fair, but then we should not be trying to reduce inequality further than that, because then it becomes unfair again. Then we're compensating the ER doctor less than the ER doctor should be receiving, rather than the amount that they should be, not more, not less.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, even if you look back at countries like communist Russia or places like that back in the last century, I mean, it also depends on the way you analyze things, because even if you look at things and you notice that most of society was roughly at the same level, you still have the elites that probably had much more money and other types of resources than like 99% of society or something like that.
Yeah, so when you get into the details of the different societies that we've had, number one, we're outside my area of expertise, right? Then we're into history and politics and other things I don't know as much about. But it seems like, especially when you look at the larger scale, we don't really have societies that have achieved equality for any length of time as examples to even look at. I think the clearest examples are small-scale kibbutzim in Israel that have been able to have some amount of equality really imposed across the entire group for any reasonable length of time. Although I think that over time there's been less and less of that going on, but I don't want to state that strongly. I don't really know the history there well enough to try to summarize it for anyone.
Okay, fair enough. So let's end the interview now, Dr. Sheskin. And before we go, would you like to tell people what would be some of the best places on the internet if they want to learn more about your work?
Sure. So I have a website that's up. That's just my name. So Mark, M-A-R-K, and then Sheskin, which is spelled like the two words she and skin, .com. So you can find me there. If you just Google my name, I think you'll find me other places on the Minerva website, etc. But the other thing I think I should probably mention is thechildlab.com. The word "the" is important there, thechildlab.com, which is the research platform I'm involved with, where parents and children from around the world can participate in live video chats. This is based out of Yale. So rather than needing to be near Yale or travel to Yale, you can do a video chat, parents and children, with one of the researchers to participate in cool psychology research, which might be exciting.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview so that people can go and check it out. It's very interesting, at least the work that I read. So, Dr. Sheskin, thank you a lot again for taking the time to come on the show, and it was a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you so much. This has been great.
Hi everybody, thank you for watching this interview until the end. As you might have noticed, I've started this channel in February 2018 and have been putting out regular interviews with academics and intellectuals from a variety of fields. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you don't like Patreon, you also have the options of supporting me via Subscribestar or PayPal. All of the links are in the description box of the video. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litske, Anne Blanchett, Perel Galarson, Lau Guerrero, Chantel Gelinas, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunda, Brian Rivera, Lucas Stafiniak, Sergio Condriano, Janne Henninen, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, John Connors, Adam Castle, Vega Gidi, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Dr. Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, and Bo Weingard, and my three producers, Isar Webbe, Rosie, and Jim Frank. Thank you for all.